I used to have everything a man could dream of: wealth, a beautiful family, and a prestigious job at a multinational oil company in Texas. Life was perfect. But it all began to unravel when I brought home a small artifact from a trip to Egypt: a sculpture of a man kneeling with a plate, seemingly begging for alms. At the time, I didn't think much of it. We were in Cairo for an oil exploration project, and I had a free afternoon to explore the city. Wandering into a dimly lit mall tucked away in a narrow alley, I found the sculpture in a dusty corner of an antique shop. It was peculiar yet captivating, made of black stone that seemed to absorb light. The details were unnervingly lifelike: the hunched posture, the weathered face of the beggar, and the outstretched plate that seemed to plead silently for mercy. It was oddly haunting, but I thought it would make a unique piece for my collection. The shopkeeper hesitated when I asked about it. "This is not for decoration," he said in heavily accented English, his eyes darting nervously to the sculpture. "Everything is for sale at the right price," I replied, offering him a wad of cash. He sighed and reluctantly took the money, muttering something under his breath that I didn't bother to decipher. When I brought it back to Texas, my wife, Emily, was less than impressed. "Why would you bring something so creepy into our home?" she asked, crossing her arms as she studied the sculpture on our living room shelf. "It's just art," I replied, brushing off her concerns. That night, I dreamt of a man kneeling in the desert, his face hidden under a tattered hood. He was holding a plate, his voice whispering incoherent words that sounded like a plea. The dream felt so real that I woke up drenched in sweat. The image of the beggar burned into my mind. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. It started small: missed meetings, misplaced documents, and a series of minor setbacks at work. I was known for being meticulous, but suddenly everything seemed to slip through my fingers. Then, my bank account was hacked, draining a substantial amount of my savings. At home, Emily grew distant. She seemed irritated with me all the time, snapping at the smallest things. Our two kids, Sam and Lily, started acting out, skipping school and hanging out with questionable friends. The turning point came when I discovered that I had been impersonated. I arrived at work one day, only to be told that I had already been there the day before, canceling a crucial meeting with one of our biggest clients. My colleagues said they had spoken to me, but I had no memory of it. That night, I reviewed the security footage from the office. What I saw made my blood run cold. The man on the screen looked exactly like me, same face, same voice, but there was something off about him. His eyes were darker, his movements almost mechanical. And when he smiled, it wasn't a smile of warmth, but one of malice. I turned to Emily, desperate to explain, but she wouldn't listen. She called me paranoid and refused to look at the footage. A week later, she packed her bags and left, taking the kids with her. Alone in the house, the atmosphere grew unbearable. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and at night, I could hear faint whispers coming from the living room. Once I woke to find the sculpture on the floor, though I had placed it securely on the shelf. Desperation drove me to seek answers. I turned to a local occultist, a man who claimed to have experience with cursed objects. He performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting over the sculpture. But as the flames flickered, the air grew heavy, and an invisible force knocked him to the ground. "This is beyond my power," he said, his voice trembling. "This artifact carries an ancient curse, a curse of eternal poverty." I pressed him for more information, but he refused to speak further, leaving me with a sense of dread that refused to fade. I next sought out a traditional healer, someone who had been recommended by a colleague. She studied the sculpture, running her fingers over its cold surface. Her eyes widened in shock, and she quickly pushed it back toward me. "This was made to ruin," she said. "It doesn't just bring misfortune, it feeds on your despair." She suggested burying it far away, but something inside me resisted the idea. I felt an unexplainable attachment to the artifact, as if letting it go would only worsen my fate. Then came the night when I nearly lost my life. I was driving home from a late meeting, the highway dimly lit and empty. Out of nowhere, a shadowy figure appeared in the middle of the road. Slamming on the brakes, I swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision. My car spun out of control and crashed into a ditch. When I stumbled out of the wreckage, shaken but alive, I saw him, the beggar from my dreams. He stood on the edge of the road, holding his plate out toward me. His face was still obscured, but I could feel his eyes piercing through me. Before I could move, he vanished, leaving only the sound of his whispered pleas echoing in the night. With no other options, I began researching the artifact myself. My search led me to an ancient historian named Dr. Khaled, a scholar specializing in Egyptian curses and folklore. When I showed him a picture of the sculpture, his expression darkened. "This is the idol of abject despair," he said. "It was created by a cursed priest who sought revenge after being betrayed and left to die in the desert. He poured all his suffering and hatred into this artifact, ensuring that anyone who possessed it would share his misery." He explained that the sculpture didn't just bring poverty, it actively sabotaged its owner's life. The entity attached to it would mimic its owner, destroying relationships, careers, and reputations. "But why me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You chose it," Dr. Khaled said simply, "and now it has chosen you." By the time I left Dr. Khaled's office, the weight of the truth had crushed any remaining hope I had. I returned home to find my house in shambles, my remaining possessions gone. The sculpture sat in the center of the empty living room, its dark surface gleaming as if mocking me. I tried to destroy it, hammering, burning, even submerging it in acid, but it remained unscathed. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows in my home seemed to take on a life of their own. One night, I woke to find the beggar standing at the foot of my bed, his plate outstretched. His face was no longer obscured, and what I saw will haunt me forever. His hollow eyes were filled with an eternity of suffering, his mouth twisted into a grin that spoke of malice and despair. "You cannot escape," he whispered. In a final act of desperation, I fled the house, leaving everything behind. I wandered for months, a shadow of my former self, until I finally found refuge in a small town far away. But even now, I am not free. At night, I hear the faint clink of coins hitting a plate and the whispered plea of the beggar, "Spare some mercy." And sometimes in the darkness, I see him, the cursed figure that ruined my life, waiting patiently for the day when I will kneel beside him, holding my own plate of despair.